Hello, I'm Ian Livingstone. I'm here to tell you about Shadow of the Giants, my new Fighting Fantasy game book, here on Forbidden Planet TV.
Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV. I'm Andrew Sumner, and I am joined by the one, the only, the legendary gaming figure, Sir Ian Livingstone, C.B.E. How are you, mate?
I'm all right, thank you very much. Please call me Ian.
Yeah, I absolutely will. And anything for a fellow Northwesterner, So we were just talking about football off camera, but we're not going to be talking about that now. We're going to be talking about something that, as I mentioned previously to you, Ian, when I told my brother and my Neil Sumner and my colleague Duncan Baisley that I was meeting with you today, they went absolutely bananas because fighting fancy is such a massive part of both of their lives. How does it feel to have created something, with one of your old schoolmates that has gone on to be so massively influential over the decades?
I think it's only in recent years that we've realized what an effect our books had on people, not just their imaginations, but on their future vision of the world and where they fit in it and what kind of careers they had and what an impact it had on them as people. When we wrote them, we had no idea that they were going to have such an effect. I mean, we were just trying to do something different, moving from a passive linear book to an interactive book in which you, the reader, are the hero. Of course, that was the most attractive bit about it, the fact that you the reader were actually playing through a book rather than just reading a book and making choices, and that choice was empowering, and as though people were actually there on those adventures, and it had a huge impact on people's imaginations and made people want to be join the creative industries or get really involved in creating content rather than just consuming content.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely what it did for my brother Neil. I mean, and he's been involved in the creative industries all his career. But I mean, I remember there was a transition point in '82 when he was reading Hardy Boys books all the time, which are great in their own right, and which my granddad was buying for him. And he literally saw the Warlock of Firetop Mountain as soon as it hit the shops in Church Street and Central Living Duke Street, and he brought that back, and that completely changed the course of his reading habits. Then he was completely. He used to read and reread the books. I think that's one of the beauties of the way that they're designed. It was a real addiction for him.
I'm delighted to hear that he wasn't alone. But I mean, the way they even came about was quite kind of fortuitous in a way. We were running Games Workshop. We used to hold these events called Games Days, and we had other people with their own trade stands, and one of those was Penguin Books, and the editor there, Geraldine Cook, was fascinated by a hall full of people playing Dungeons and Dragons almost obsessively. And she said to Steve Jackson and myself, hey, would you mind writing a book about Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games? And we said, well, kind of off the cuff, without realizing what we're getting ourselves into, said, well, rather than writing a book about it, why don't we write a book that allows you to experience what a role-playing game would be like? And she thought that was a fantastic idea. So we said, yeah, great, we'll send in a synopsis, without knowing what that could possibly be. So we just distilled role-playing into a much more simple choice-based system where the book replaced the dungeon master. But so it became a branching narrative, but we applied a game system to it to give a sense of playing and reading at the same time, kind of solo game book adventure. That was the basic concept and which ended up being the Warlock of Firetop Mountain.
How much of an influence do you think the early books were in? I struggled. I hesitate to use this word, but almost like legitimizing the world of role playing games and giving people the basic infrastructure of how that's done on a more mass level.
Well, when we wrote them, role playing was still kind of a niche hobby for hobby gamers, as we used to call them. Kind of mainstream Games Workshop people. But Fighting Fantasy took it to a much wider audience and allowed people who had never heard of a fantasy role-playing game to enjoy being in a fantasy world in which they were journeying and making all the choices of slaying monsters and finding treasure and going in these great these adventures of the mind.
Yeah. Ian, how long did it take you and Steve to put together the first book, Warlock of Firetook Mountain? How the creative process to come up with that? How long did it take you guys?
It was an absolute nightmare writing the first one because we hadn't done it before, so you're starting off fresh, and also complicated by deciding to write the first one with both of us. I mean, so how do you write an interactive book with two authors? It even sounds a ridiculous idea from the start, but we managed to do it. So I wrote the first half up to the river, and Steve wrote the second half, including his terrifying maze to the end where you meet Zagor and hopefully slay the poor wizard for his loot. And but it was difficult because you're writing several branching narratives at once with separate threads depending on what you choose. You turn left, turn right simplistically, and you have a key to open a door or not. So there's obviously hundreds of ways of going through the book. So you then had to pass that over to Steve and say, well, if they choose this path, they would have done this. If they chose this path, they would have found that. If they chose this path, they'd done this. So I made it. We cut the book in half with a river, and I made 3 crossing points, and that was the great handover to Steve to do the second half. But it's very difficult anyway writing a fighting fantasy game because you've got these multiple story threads going on. You've also got to balance it for difficulty. You've got to balance it for the economy, so there's not too much or too little gold. And then you have to have an overarching story that is compelling enough to want to go on the quest in the first place. So it was a nightmare, the first one, but we did it. And luckily, a lot of people enjoy what we did when it first published in August 1982.
Did that take you by surprise?
Well, they started off selling quite slowly because Penguin Books, the publishers, who ended up putting it under their Puffin level.
It was the Puffin imprint, wasn't it?
It took them over a year to decide whether or not to do it. Apparently, senior management laughed so hard that the head person banged his head on the table at the idea of an interactive book. And the salespeople didn't really know what to do with them. So they just kind of put them on the shelves and hope for the best. So we were promoting a bit through White Dwarf magazine. But our big breakthrough really came when we got on Radio 1. And it was a great program we did, and where we were reading out the choices and listeners would phone in and make the choices. And there's a lot of enthusiasm about that. So children started buying them in certain parts of the UK, and it spread by word of mouth through the playground. That was the virality of the day, the playground chat. And then it kind of networked out and all linked up, and suddenly became a nationwide craze.
Yeah, I totally believe that from my brother's dog-eared copies in his satchel or in his his footy bag or whatever. That's absolute. I can see that. I mean, that's brilliant once you start capturing the imaginations of the playgrounds in that way, seeing that like light on fire. That must have been a very proud moment.
It was, and we also helped in a lot of negative press around them as well, because we had undead creatures like ghouls and demons. The Evangelical Alliance published an 8-page warning guide about them, saying because you're interacting with these undead creatures, you're bound to get possessed by the devil.
Yeah.
And a bored housewife in deeper suburbia phoned a local radio station and said, having read one of my books, her son levitated. So the kids are thinking, what, for £1.50 I can fly? We'll have some of that. The local vicar near Penguin Books threatened to chain himself to the railings of Penguin Books until they were banned. There were petitions sent in by worried parents. There was a church reverend who got the whole congregation worried about the satanic panic. And of course, this was marvelous. At the same time, people were beginning to realize, teachers and some parents realizing that they were actually great for reluctant readers, short attention span, great for creativity, great for critical thinking, great for kind of algorithmic thinking, improved literacy levels by some 20%. Hey, Dad, what's a sarcophagus? And the fact that they encouraged the people to want to go over and over again, that they could fail and want to try again. They weren't punished for making a mistake. So it was that agency given to the reader that was so compelling.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. I mean, it's kind of indexes quite interestingly with what happened with the States in the 50s and Frederick Wertham and comic books and the Comics Code and all that. And it's that, it's that connection between improved literacy and those things that allow you to read and critically think at an early age. Actually, the very, very positive experiences, right? But harnessing that moral panic, that's the word, right? For that kind of syndrome. That just must have been such an interesting tunnel to travel through.
Yeah, but we didn't get many great pieces of press. It was ridiculous, really, considering we were selling ridiculous numbers of books. I mean, when Death Trap Dungeon first came out in '84, it sold like 400,000 copies. It was the 8th best-selling book in the UK, including the adults list.
Yeah.
And so I was invited to go on Saturday Superstore to talk about the top 10 books of children's books. So we started at number 10, 8, 9, and John Craven was interviewing me. And we finally got to 3, 2, and 1, and they were all mine. And I'd explained what was appealing about the other books 4 to 10. And the first question he asked me is, when are you going to write a proper book? I said, well, these books are getting children reading. Sure, it doesn't matter if it's a comic or an interactive book. Surely it's great that children love reading. They can move on to Shakespeare whenever they feel ready. But in the meantime, let them enjoy the medium.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's very, very well said. To flip forward to now, you've got 2 new books that are coming out from Scholastic. There's The Secrets of Salamonis, written by Steve, and there's Shadow of the Giants, written by yourself. What can you tell me about those?
Well, let's start off with mine because I know that better.
Yeah, of course.
It's based in Alancia, which is the world we've built up over about 40 years now, where all my fantasy books are located, from City of Thieves, Forest of Doom, Wall of Firetop Mountain, etc., etc. And so this is another one in that world. So it references parts of that world and characters in that world and some monsters in that world. And I realized I'd never done anything with giants before. So I thought it's high time we had some awful giants who are going to wreak havoc around Alancia. So the basic idea is you think you're going on another quest to Firetop Mountain, as people would expect for the 40th anniversary. So you do actually start in there. But what ends up is you unearth a treasure that in fact releases these giants, which grow as soon as they touch the ground into these enormous iron earth crushers, for want of a better expression. And your task is to find out how you can destroy them because they look impregnable, and then find somebody who can tell you what you need to destroy them. So the quest is to save Alancia by destroying these 4 iron giants.
Brilliant.
And of course, I look forward to people failing, because it's my joy is trying to lure people down the wrong path. The rose petals to their doom falling on iron spikes. Is my mission.
I was going to ask you about exactly that. How much mental power does it take to sit there and plot out these outcomes that might look initially appealing, but is that the fun of it for you?
Well, I enjoy trying to hide the one true path, as it were.
Yeah.
And try and make the awful grisly path sound the right choice to make. But from writing them, I still do it the same way as I did 40 years ago in writing 400 paragraph numbers and crossing off the numbers as you go. So you start off a reference 1 and you split it into whatever 2 or 3 choices. And so you get 77, 216, 44. And you write it as a flowchart and on a physical map. And I can show you the map of the Death Dungeon.
I would love to see that.
Right, yeah. So this was the original 1984 map of the flowchart of Death Trap Dungeon. So you can see how it starts. And
that is amazing.
You make all the annotations and keep a record of all the things that happen, the things you find, and then you fly through the whole thing, and eventually you get to the end. So I still do it exactly the same way.
Great.
And it helps me keep a track of all the multiple paths and the options. And then I realize, I need a key here, so I have to go back in the adventure and drop the key where they might find it. But you're not looking for keys particularly in Shadows of the Giant, in case you were wondering. And as for Steve's book, Secrets of Salamonis, well, Steve has a a penchant for making his books really difficult. The more difficult they are, more people want to solve them. So this one is in Salamonis, which is again set in Alancia, and it's very quest driven. You have to go on multiple quests to find this information, which will ultimately find out what to do with the shivering men. And I can't really tell you any more about that because without giving too much away, but it's fiendishly trap ridden and difficult as Steve always does in his usual way, which is great.
Oh, that's brilliant, Ian. I mean, it's great to have you on, and it's great to see Scholastic doing so well with Fighting Fantasy, and it's great to be talking about these two books, both of which, by the way, can be ordered from the links attached to our conversation. And before we wrap up, when you look back on your career within gaming, what do you feel in terms of how the whole world sits within human society these days? I mean, I'm asking because it seems to me, who's as an observer, that there's been that it's so much more accepted and understood. The positive power of it all is understood in a way that just wasn't the way, as you touched on a bit, when I was a kid. Nowadays, you must feel very proud of what you've achieved in the gaming business.
Well, I think I know I've tried my whole life to tell about the power of play and the good it brings to people. And also I've had a long career in video games as well.
Of course.
And both analog and digital games and Final Fantasy game books all have this commonality, is that if you part your prejudice against one or two titles in video games that are 18 rated and shouldn't be played by children in the first place, and think cognitively what happens when you're playing a game or reading a Final Fantasy game book, they require you to problem solve. So you're using your brain in a very positive way, solving problems. You learn intuitively. You're not punished for making a mistake like you are in an exam. You're encouraged to try again, and over time you will be successful. And we all know we learn at different rates, but no one is a loser in a game. You always we win at different rates and different times. And games encourage creativity. I mean, in video games, a game like Minecraft, a child can learn in context, learning by doing, albeit digital, that by applying the heat of applying the heat of a furnace to silica sand, they can make glass, and they take their glass and put it in their environments, and they build these wonderful 3D architectural worlds and share them with their friends. And that is construction and doing, and they won't forget that. But if someone's telling them those facts in a broadcast model of the traditional teaching, that they're half asleep because there's no context for them. So I think games are a contextual hub for learning, and they give you life skills, problem solving, multidisciplinary activities when you're playing a video game, and it's fun. Why can't learning be fun? Games are effectively a management simulation in many ways. Games like Roller Coaster Tycoon understand the physics of building the rides, the staffing levels required to run them, and then the pricing. That is an economic model, and if you do it right, you get the customers will come in, and if you don't, you just tweak the parameters until, again, over time, everyone can be a winner. And so there's a great sense of achievement without the pressure of a memory test as in a school. So you can learn huge amounts of life skills playing games, or, as I said, reading Final Fantasy game books is a good thing now, it's seen, as well as having a fantastic time. So what's not to like?
Well said, absolutely well said, mate. And it's I think that's actually bang on the nose. And who better for it to come from than yourself? And Ian, thanks so much for joining me to talk about Shadow of the Giants. Again, available here. It's been a real delight chatting with you, mate.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, take care. All the very best.
Bye-bye.
If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.